This is the fourth in the series of training for judging 4-H quilts. This is Phyllis Shainholtz, Extension Educator for Nebraska Extension, and we're going to focus this time on workmanship. Will the construction and the quality last the intended life of the exhibit, whether it's a quilt or another exhibit? What is the workmanship? What's the construction? How is it made? Did the quilt maker choose the appropriate fabric for the item? Consider the use and the care required. The coat seams are intended to fray, so homespun was chosen. The oversized coat will shrink when it's washed. Extra support was needed at the purse on the bottom. Soft fabrics for baby items and special decorations were added to the photo album. A good quality quilt will have the corners and points match, unless the pattern specifically calls for them not to. Notice the quilt on the right. The blocks are the same size, yet the corners do not match as intended. The gray ruler shows how far off the corners are. This top needs to be readjusted. Applique is adding another layer of fabric to the quilt. Consider again the use and care. How should it be applied? Hand stitched? Or maybe machine stitched, especially satin stitching, will securely hold the applique in place during use and laundry. Sometimes fraying is intended, so stitch close to the edge of the raw edges. A bonding agent is just right for the winter seam. The design of the fabric will determine whether the seams in the row should be parallel. Extra care should be taken to make sure that they're even across the piece. The pieces or the block should be straight, although for a country look or a casual or rustic look, the quilt maker may allow the fabric to be off grain. Does the quilting or the tied knots support the quilt's intended use and care? Tied knots should be 3 to 5 inches apart. Several quilting techniques can be used, with the intent that all 3 layers of the quilt will be stabilized, held together, and to prevent bunching up of the batting and the fabric. After the quilt has been quilted or tied, it needs to be prepared for the binding. Measure to see if the width and the length of the quilt is even. Cut away any excess fabric by squaring up the corners according to the pattern or design. Does the quilt lay flat? Is it ready for binding? We know that some quilts call for an unfinished or raggy look, but most quilts call for a binding. If applied, it should be finished. I've judged quilts where the binding was sewn by machine on the front of the quilt but was left hanging loose on the back. All edges should be completed. A good binding will feel full. Lesser quality bindings barely capture the quilt in the binding. A preferred method is to miter the corners of the binding, not the rounded corners of the quilt on the left. Hand stitch down the miter on both the front and the back to keep it securely in place. This can prevent it from being torn loose during use and laundry. Is the quilt ready to use? Does it lie flat, or does it need pressing? Is there a label on the back? If it's a wall hanging, is there a way to allow for a hanger? Notice the twine on the left quilt and the tree branch. The loops on the right quilts are there to be used for hanging. Is it ready for use? QuiltQuest allows other non-fabric exhibits to tell about maybe quilt history, family history, computer designs, paper quilts, wood, glass, etc. Judge the exhibit according to the score sheet. Keep in mind the presentation of the exhibit, the creativity in design, and the quality of workmanship. Barn quilts are becoming very popular. Consider where the barn quilt will be displayed. If it's to be outside, there should be appropriate primer and paint should be applied to all of the surfaces. I've judged beautiful barn quilts, yet the back side was left untouched. The raw wood will probably warp in wet conditions. Protect all surfaces with paint. This QuiltQuest training has been reviewed by the QuiltQuest authors, instructors, and quilting instructors. Thank you again for judging 4-H quilts and watching the training videos.